Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.net. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to most likely conclude the book today, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. And I hope as we wrap this up that you will reflect on what all the author has covered in this book, and that you will consider it a valuable asset to your library, and that you may seek to obtain a copy of it, whether in its original form or a recent reprint. I understand there are those who are still publishing this book, and they're available on eBay and in used and new bookstores. They may be ordered, and that you will purchase a copy of this book and read it for yourself and share it with friends. Now, for those following along, we'll begin with the first full paragraph on page 708 in the book. Again, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. Remember, last time we were reading some of the tenets of the papal encyclical called Unum Sanctum by Pope Boniface VIII. It is necessary for every human being to be subject to the Roman Pontiff. That is the main thrust of that encyclical. And now we'll begin. It says, the distinctive principles proclaimed by this bull, and now a part of the canon law of the Roman Church, he sets down as follows. Here are the tenets of the encyclical, or rather the bull Unum Sanctum by Pope Boniface VIII. First, quote, it is necessary to salvation that every man should submit to the Roman Pontiff. Number two. Second, unquote. Second, quote, this is a necessary consequence of the dogma of papal supremacy, unquote. Third, quote, it condemns the assertion of the state of any power over, quote-unquote, church property, close quotes. Fourth, quote, the temporal power of Christian princes does not exempt them from obedience to the head of the church, unquote. That is the Pope. As the kings of the Christian nations, the governments of all Christian nations are to be obedient to the Pope. And as unlikely as it may seem to my listeners, the government of the United States is obedient to the Pope, not the people. Fifth, quote, the material sword is drawn for the church, the spiritual by the church, unquote. We elaborated on that yesterday, so I won't do it again today. Sixth, quote, the material sword must cooperate with the spiritual and assist it, unquote. Seventh, quote, the secular power should be guided by the spiritual as the higher, unquote. Eighth, quote, the spiritual has the preeminence over the material, unquote. Ninth, quote, the temporal power is subordinated to the ecclesiastical as to the higher, unquote. 10th, quote, the temporal power, if it is not good, is judged by the spiritual, unquote. 11th, quote, to the ecclesiastical authority, that is to say the Pope and his hierarchy, the words of the prophet Jeremiah apply. Quote, lo, I have set thee this day over the nations and over kingdoms, to root up and to pull down, and to waste and to destroy, and to build and to plant. Close quotes. 12th, that when, quote, the temporal power goes astray, it is judged by the spiritual, unquote. 13th, quote, for obtaining eternal happiness, each one is required to submit to the Pope, unquote. 14th, quote, the supremacy of the Pope, even in temporal things, unquote. And 15th, the Popes, quote, recognize human authorities in their proper place till they lift up their will against God, unquote. Those are the tenets of Unum Sanctum. That it is necessary for every man, woman, and child, as a matter of salvation, it is necessary for them to be subject to the Pope. And the nations, as a whole, must be subjected to the Pope just as every individual is. That's the essence of this bull. And these quotes bear it out. It's directly taken from the bull of Pope Boniface VIII called Unum Sanctum. Now, for those who would like to do their own research, I'll give you the proper spelling so you can Google it or put it into your search engine, do your own research on this papal bull. Unum Sanctum is spelled UNAMSANCTAM. Unum Sanctum. UNAMSANCTAM. Unum Sanctum. I encourage my listeners to do their own research. Now, he continues, this book has upon it the imprint of the Catholic Publishing Society of New York and is extensively circulated in the United States for the enlightenment and instruction of the faithful. Obviously, it's referring to Roman Catholic faithful. Its general character is recommended by an introduction wherein it is said that, quote, the spiritual royalty of Christ's vicar will ultimately tend to consolidate a new temporal monarchy and all its concomitant institutions, unquote. And the preference entertained by papists for a monarchical over a popular or democratic form of government is thus unequivocally avowed. Quote, the Church, it is truly said, needs not kings and emperors, but civil society and great states need them. And this is especially true under the Christian dispensation, which by the abolition of slavery has indefinitely multiplied popular suffrages and therefore aggravated the difficulties of popular government, unquote. And in a note, so as not to confuse my listeners, the author has included a note of explanation here. He said the reference here is not made of the abolition of slavery in the United States, but to the elevation of the masses of the people in Europe. Remember, all of Europe was enslaved by the papacy, and their deliverance came by the Protestant Reformation. They had been liberated by the gospel of Jesus Christ, by Christ himself. The Protestant Reformation was a move of God, a biblical rejection of the Pope and the papal system and the Roman Catholic Church. They heeded the command of Revelation 18, verse 4 and 5. Come out of her, my people. And that's what they did. They came out of the Roman Catholic Church in obedience to Christ and in rejection of Antichrist. Now, with that context, I'll read it again. It says, and the preference entertained by papists for a monarchical over a popular or democratic form of government is thus unequivocally avowed. Quote, the Church, it is truly said, needs not kings and emperors, but civil society and great states need them. And this is especially true under the Christian dispensation, which, by the abolition of slavery, has indefinitely multiplied popular suffrages, in other words, popular governments, and therefore aggravated the difficulties of popular government, unquote. Now, we have here the deliberate sentiments and purposes of the papacy, that is, of the only legitimate authority of the Church. No individual opinions weigh a feather's weight in the scale against them. although uttered by 1 or 1,000 prelates or laymen. Every man who has any connection whatever with the church must accept them without change or modification as a necessary part of the faith. If he shall accept them and is intelligent enough to understand them, he must be regarded as prepared to take all the consequences which must necessarily follow if they are pressed, as now seems inevitable, to their legitimate results. But if, like the old Catholics of Europe, the Roman Catholic population of the United States shall sternly and manfully rebuke these political religious teachings of the papacy, they will yet retain the power to save their honored and venerable church from open antagonism with the government which shields them so effectually from harm and carrying her back to those smooth and pleasant paths of peace and quiet and Christian concord, where she once stood so proudly, and where they, side by side with other Christians, may dispense the cheerful and benignant influences of pure, tolerant, and apostolic Christianity. I wish to take issue again, one last time with the author. He presumes that this is or at least a Christian church. Inquisition Update maintains that this is the counterfeit church. While prophesied by God that it would be in the world to test God's people, to destroy God's people, to fulfill its diabolical but prophetic role in the world, this church is non-reformable. It's not of Christ. It did not have good Christian beginnings. It was evil from the very beginning. And it is legitimate, in my view, to hope that the Roman Catholics in this country will be so cognizant of history and so cognizant of papal history and the history of the Roman Catholic Church and their meddling in the political affairs of nations throughout its existence, that they will follow the example of so many Catholics before them, that they will exert their manhood and stand up and tell their Pope, enough is enough. Stay out of our political affairs. If they choose to continue to consider the papacy as their spiritual leader, as long as religious freedom continues in this country, maybe they can continue to regard him as their spiritual leader. But Catholics of the United States must, as did the Gallican Catholics of France, stand up and tell the Pope to butt out. And if not, then I'm afraid, together with their ecumenical evangeli-belly counterparts, papal oppression and tyranny will be the norm. And so will religious persecution of the worst kind, of the worst examples that history has ever seen, right here in the United States of America. Now, continuing, he says, how beautifully and harmoniously were unity and diversity blended in the churches of the early Christians. Diversity in discipline and economy. Unity centering in Christ as the rock upon which it was built. The rock was Christ, not Peter. He says, then the bishops of Jerusalem, of Antioch, of Alexandria, of Corinth and Rome, and elsewhere presided over the clergy and people of their respected churches and provinces, with the internal policy and economy of each so conducted as should best promote the advancement of Christianity, leaving its external policy under the superintendence of the whole church, not as it concerned discipline and government, but only the prime and essential part of the religion, the preservation of the Christian faith. Neither Christ nor his apostles made provision for any form of church imperialism. He did all things perfectly. He established this simple plan of a perfect church, leaving the apostles to rear the superstructure. They, with inspired wisdom, built the churches at Jerusalem and Antioch and other cities of Asia before a Christian was ever known to be at Rome. And their work was also well and perfectly done, so well and perfectly that it was scarcely needed to be repeated at Rome in order to establish the quote-unquote true church of Jesus Christ. There was everything to commend this plan of the Master, capital M, that is Christ, and the apostles. The city of Jerusalem, in the midst of the fallen columns of the quote-unquote temple of God, and near Calvary and Gethsemane and Bethlehem, and where Christ had first disputed with the learned doctors of the Jewish law, and whose streets had been trodden by his feet, this quote-unquote holy city was a far more fitting place for planting the first Christian church than the old pagan and imperial city of the Caesars, where God's providence had been defied for centuries, where the name of Christ was cast out with derision and reproach, where Christianity was held to be a pernicious and dangerous superstition, where the demon of persecution first held its bloody orgies, and where vice and corruption were consuming all its pagan glories, and leaving it wrapped in clouds of life-consuming miasma, to become the place where the curse of God would surely rest, as it had once rested upon the old Babylon of the Euphrates. You see the inference of the author here? That Rome is not the old Babylon of the Euphrates, but it is the new Babylon. And that's what the Bible calls it. Our author, R.W. Thompson, perfectly understood that Rome was Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. He continues, as the first churches of Asia were established under the express commission of Christ before the Church of Rome, it was manifestly against the divine plan of the latter church, that is the Roman Church, to set up the false claim that she was, quote-unquote, the mother and mistress of all the churches. Besides the presumption and vanity of the assumption, it was untrue in point of fact. For the church at Jerusalem is conceded by all hands to have been the quote-unquote mother church. On this account, the apostles assembled there to settle their differences which had arisen among the Christians at Antioch. And here, appropriately, the author gives us a note. It says, Roman Catholics claim that at this first council of the apostles, the primacy of Peter over the other apostles was recognized. In other words, that he, Peter, was then regarded as, quote-unquote, the prince of the apostles. He says this is not warranted by the recorded facts. Peter, on account probably of his advanced age and great wisdom, was the first whose speech is recorded. But it must be observed that he uttered no opinion or decision to bind the others. On the contrary, he merely opened the discussion and was followed by Barnabas and Paul, and after them, James, who was Bishop of Jerusalem, spoke manifestly with the authority of a superior position. He desired all present to, quote, hearken, unquote, unto what he said. And when he had set forth his views, he said, quote, wherefore my sentence is, unquote, etc. See verse 19. This shows that if there was any precedence, it belonged to James, who must have presided. In the Roman Catholic Douay Bible, this verse reads, quote, "Wherefore I judge," unquote, etc., following the Latin Vulgate, ego judico. But the word judico does not mean a mere individual opinion. It means a judgment, a sentence, or decision announced by authority. Hence the conclusion that James possessed official superiority in this council cannot be escaped. So the whole basis of the Roman Catholic Church, which asserts that Peter is the rock and foundation of the church, that he was Prince of the Apostles, and that the popes are his spiritual successors, is nothing but shifting sand. It's not based in reality. It's not based in fact. It's not based in biblical fact. It's a human invention. The papacy is entirely a human invention. Now, the author continues. He says, the Roman Catholic Church was therefore the daughter, not the mother and the mistress, the daughter of the older Asiatic churches, not the mother. They preceded her in order of time so far that Christianity was planted by means of them, before Rome had a beginning, or before it had reached any part of Europe. These Asiatic churches possessed undoubtedly all the external authority which Christ designed should be conferred upon his church. For being presided over by the apostles and especially cared for by them, it is an impeachment of them to say that in this or in any other respect they failed in obeying the divine injunction to establish the church rightfully. While the system they organized continued, everything worked well and harmoniously. If there were differences, they were adjusted by conference, as at Jerusalem, and nothing occurred to plant discord among them until the church at Rome endeavored to bring them all to her feet. At every step she took in that direction, she struck fatal blows at this original system of church organization and never rested from her work of demolition until the columns of all the ancient churches had fallen to the ground. To add to the efficacy of her measures, she snatched from the state the imperialism of temporal power, which she employed as the means of achieving her universal dominion, and thus, by uniting church and state, she has afflicted both herself and the world with incalculable calamities. As usurpation and imposture have their reward, as well as virtue, these have been visited upon her in terrible abundance, since she sought to place the triple crown upon the brows of her bishops, and to gild her papal palaces with gold. Ever since the time of Constantine and the Nicene Creed, she has been dealing in various modes of compulsion with multitudes of her rebellious and heretical children, born within her fold and nurtured upon her bosom. The most formidable resistance she has encountered has been invited by the vacillations of her faith, or has been produced by the tyranny and persecutions of papacy. And now we've come upon the break. We'll continue with our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power, when we return. This is Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.net.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
The book of Revelation says, "The spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ." This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Papacy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Papacy Reality News app installed today, so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Papacy Reality News app. Get it now.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. The second half hour, as well as the first half hour, were brought to you by First Amendment Radio, who sponsors the program. If you wish to support Inquisition Update, please support FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and we thank Brother Nicholas for supporting the program. Now, continuing with our conclusion of the book, it says, ever since the time of Constantine and the Nicene Council, she, that is the Roman Catholic Church, has been dealing in various modes of compulsion with multitudes of her rebellious and heretical children, born within her fold and nurtured upon her bosom. The most formidable resistance she has encountered has been invited by the vacillations of her faith, or has been produced by the tyranny and persecutions of the papacy. The hardest blows under which she has reeled and staggered, and under which she is now reeling and staggering, have been struck by those who have been compelled to strike them in order to assert and vindicate their manhood by breaking the fetters with which she has manacled their limbs. Before the Protestant Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church had some good popes, and I would question that. How can Antichrist be proclaimed as good by anyone? Only one is good, and that is our Father in heaven. It says, before the Protestant Reformation, the Roman Catholic Church had some good popes, many bad ones, and some who were almost monsters of impiety and vice. The 70 years of papal residence in France had created a rivalry in crime and prostitution between the two pontifical cities, Rome and Avignon. And whenever the one excelled the other, it was only because of the larger number of cardinals and priests and of the courtesans or prostitutes who followed them. Of course, reformers grew up in formidable numbers, for there were many good men in the church belonging to every class. but anti-reformers existed in greater force, composed of those who held the chief authority in the Roman Church. Of the first, there were those who believed in all Christian sincerity that the Church could be reformed within herself, and thus her life and purity be preserved. Of the latter, there were those who either supposed that corruption had done its work so thoroughly that the disease was beyond the reach of remedy, or preferred the wealth and power which her vast revenues produced and ambition it gratified to the preservation of her purity. I offer a third alternative, that the Roman Catholic Church from the very beginning has fulfilled its prophetic role, that it was ordained of God to be what it is, the Church of Antichrist, the synagogue of Satan, the whore that rides the bloody beast of Revelation chapter 17. That, I believe, is the biblical assessment of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, the author says, and when the great Council of Trent placed the Church in a condition to become an engine of mischievous power and bad ambition in the hands of the Jesuits, it made Protestantism an absolute necessity for the world, because without it, the terrible pressure under which both church and state were rapidly sinking into a common grave could never have been removed. Protestantism, therefore, finds both its truth and its philosophy in the history of those times. God was its author. He did not design it to exterminate, but to preserve, to support the cause of truth, and to resist error. There was yet good enough in the Roman Catholic Church to have secured the complete triumph of divine truth, but for the perverseness of those who seemed to defy all the providences of God. It needed only the winnowing process of reform to separate the good from the bad, the genuine grain from the chaff, so that this venerable church could drift back again into the calm and placid current along which it had moved so beautifully and majestically in the days of her primitive purity. Again, the author errs. The author errs in believing that this was, in its original form, a Christian church. Now, the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, was not the result of impulse and passion. Preceding events had convinced the leading nations of the necessity of taking care of their own affairs, which it was evident they could not do without resisting the aggressions of the papacy. These aggressions had become so repeated and flagrant that some of the governments were entirely subordinated to Rome. With the imperialism of princes and of popes, the people were almost crushed, as it were, between the upper and the nether millstone. The necessity of self-protection and self-existence compelled them to seek out other paths. France was the foremost in the movement of resistance, as we have seen, how soon as a Christian nation, according to the papal standard, her very life would have been crushed out. Germany followed, and then England, and finally the United States rose up in the New World, clothed in fresh robes, to prove how benignantly are the influences which spring from popular government and Protestant toleration. These influences are now reacting upon the older nations, and one by one they are moving into the same paths. As the light from each increases more and more, just as it is almost ready to break out in the meridian brightness, the papal sword is unsheathed, and they are commanded under the impious pretense that God has spoken through the voice of an infallible pope to turn back into darkness and slavery and imbecility again. There are many Roman Catholic laymen in the United States who, if they could be prevailed upon to investigate these matters for themselves and to abate somewhat their unbounded confidence in their ecclesiastical superiors, would see, as many of their brethren in Europe have done, that there is a broad and manifest distinction between their church as it exists in its original purity in the days of the early fathers and that enormous papal structure into which ambitious and designing men have since converted it, with power to domineer over princes and tyrannize over peoples. It would be impossible for them not to know that in order to restore and maintain the pretensions now set up in behalf of the papacy, its emissaries would be guilty of infractions upon the rights of all existing governments, especially those where the people are the rulers, and that their own continued acquiescence in these excessive demands of the Pope and his priesthood must, in the end, lead them into opposition to the most essential principles of our own government, and especially to that which makes the people themselves included the true and legitimate source of all civil authority. It is impossible to suppose that they desire to forget the sacrifices many of them have made for the cause of popular government, or that they can become willingly insensible to the precious interests they have wrapped up in its continuance. Whatsoever they may decide, however, whether they shall resolve to become the guardians of their own civil rights, or leave them to the guardianship of an army of papal hierarchs, irresponsible to all human authority and above all human laws, the American people as a whole will not be likely to remain passive and unresisting under these continued threatenings. And when they shall be brought to realize a point they are rapidly reaching, that their popular form of government is actually and insolently threatened, that opposition to some of the most highly prized features of their civil institutions is already inaugurated with the view of substituting the power of the papacy for their own constitutional authority, and of subordinating their fundamental laws to the decrees of the popes as a foreign king and despot, when the great body of the American people shall become fully apprised of all these things, they will then understand what remedy to apply and how to apply it. Ladies and gentlemen, this author and this host, Inquisition Update, is proclaiming that we are in that period where a decision must be made. He says they will not find this remedy in the violation of any of the cherished principles of their government, by the abandonment of its liberal and tolerant spirit, or by any act unworthy a Protestant nation pledging in maintenance of free thought, free speech, and a free press. They will not find it in any form of wrong or oppression, either by withdrawing from the Roman Catholic religion any part of that protection they give to Protestants, or by excluding any who think proper to profess that religion from the shelter of their civil institutions. They will not find it by imitating the example set forth by those Roman Catholic governments that have allowed coercive measures to be employed to prohibit every form of religion but that of Rome. But they will find it by maintaining at every hazard and in the face of all consequences their right to enact their own laws, to preserve their own constitutions, and to regulate their own affairs according to their own sovereign will and without foreign dictation, by perpetuating their popular form of government as the rightful inheritance of their children, by resisting to the last the divine right of kings or popes to rule over them, by firmly refusing to permit the canon laws of the Roman Catholic Church or any other church to take the place of those of their own enacting, and by teaching the Roman hierarchy and all others who shall willingly become subservient to the schemes of the popes, that while citizens of the United States they can enjoy unimpaired all the rights of citizenship secured to themselves, but that in order to this they must render the same obedience to all existing laws which others are required to render, and that they can enjoy no exclusive privileges, whether civil or ecclesiastical, which shall put it in their power to violate the principles of American liberty, to impose unwilling restraint upon a single conscience, or to endanger the existence of a single fundamental principle upon which they have erected their civil and religious freedom. That's the end of the book. And I'll tell my listeners that every work that I've read on this program since the very beginnings of Inquisition Update 4 years ago, 5 years ago, everything that I've read on this program was in preparation for the reading of this book. This is the grand finale. Though I have no intention of quitting, everything is anticlimactic to this book. If you comprehended this book, if I did a good enough job of reading this book and explaining it and commenting upon it so that you understand it substantially, then you have to agree with me that R.W. Thompson was not only well qualified as the Secretary of the U.S. Navy, but he was qualified to write this book. I consider it one of, if not the most important book in my library. It could stop the New World Order. It could stop papal tyranny from gaining the upper hand in this country. It could identify to the seemingly blind, deaf, and dumb Christian church in this country who the Antichrist is, and that he has control of our government now. And that Vatican Council II was the most grievous error of the Protestant church since the Protestant Reformation. It was essentially a repudiation of the Protestant Reformation, an apology for having rebelled from the Roman Catholic Church to begin with, and a solemn profession that they would gradually, if not altogether, and immediately rejoin the Roman Catholic Church. And that's what's happened. And because now that the Roman Catholic hierarchy represents not only the card-carrying Catholics, they represent all of Christianity. And as Glenn Beck said in a recent program, we're all Catholics now. That's the effect of Vatican Council II. That's the effect of forgetting the history that R.W. Thompson presents for us in this book. That's the result of abandoning Protestantism and going back when God called us out of the Roman Catholic Church. The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson. I hope you can find a copy of this book. Read it for yourself, study it, and share it with friends and family. Keep it right there beside your Bible. Right there beside your copy of Fox's Book of Martyrs. Do whatever it is that you can think to do, whatever God leads you to do to restore your Protestant faith. None of this that is occurring in the United States today could happen were Protestantism as strong today as it was in the days of the founding of this country. It would not be possible. But it's not only possible, it's essentially a done deal. And so from that we must conclude that there isn't enough real, true, biblical Protestantism in this country to save it from papal tyranny. So the obvious question is, what happened to Protestantism? I'll reiterate again. Protestantism, the foundation of Protestantism was not only that Christ was the rock and foundation of the church, but that the papacy is the biblical, historical, and prophetic Antichrist, fulfilling all the prophecies of the Bible to be a Protestant, to really be a Protestant, that's what you believe. They protested Rome. They protested the papacy. They protested the blasphemous arrogations of divine attributes by the papacy. They protested the Roman Catholic Church and all of its man-made doctrines and traditions. They protested the perversion of the gospel through the Roman Catholic translations of the Scriptures. They came out of the Roman Catholic Church in obedience to God's command for His people. Why are Protestants going back and ecumenically reuniting with the Church of Antichrist? That is the next area of concern for Inquisition Update, to expose one of the greatest, if not the greatest, deception that has been perpetrated upon the body of Christ since the Garden of Eden. It's called futurism. It's a Jesuit teaching, and it was given for no other purpose than to confuse Protestants, to confuse the issue about who is the biblical Antichrist. And I get this from a tiny little booklet, one that could fit in the shirt pocket of your shirt. It's entitled The Origin of Dispensational Futurism and Its Entry into Protestant Christianity. It was written and compiled by H.C. Martin. It was published, its third edition was published in 1973. It's a relatively recent publication as relates in relation to all the other books and papers that I read here on Inquisition Update. And I'll begin by giving the title of the first chapter. It's entitled The Origin of Dispensational Futurism and Its Entry into Protestant Christianity. He says, today many Protestants have departed from the Christian interpretation of the prophecies in the book of Revelation and many other passages in the Word of God. Church history has not left us in ignorance concerning the dispensational interpretation of the book of Revelation. Every Protestant should know and spread the following startling facts. Scholarly Dean Henry Alford in 1870 informs us that the futurist school of prophecy can be traced to Jesuit Ribera in 1590. It was invented of evil purposes. For example, quote, to protect the papacy and to confuse the Protestants as to the true meaning of the revelation. This scheme is not to be commended for obvious reasons, unquote. The great Protestant reformers opened up Revelation chapter 17 and chapter 18 to all of Europe and showed the people the great whore and the scarlet women with disastrous results to the papacy. In the book of Revelation, God foretold, exposed, and denounced the works of the doctrines of the great apostate church system, which would rise out of and succeed the wreckage of the pagan Roman Empire. This apostate system was papal Rome. The Roman world had been ruled by paganism until the 4th or 5th century A.D., but now a change was destined to come to pass. This new-found power being clearly symbolized in the book of Revelation as a religious power by saying that it would be seen sitting in the temple of God. That is to say, in the church itself, swaying the lives of men and nations and ruling with great power and of self-appointed pinnacle, from a self-appointed pinnacle which it had set up. See 2 Thessalonians 2. This papal power was to emerge after the Roman Empire was removed, and would continue until it would be, quote-unquote, consumed by the spirit of his mouth and destroyed by the brightness of his coming. Praise God Almighty. 2 Thessalonians 2, verse 8. as the darkness of the Middle Ages thereafter began to lighten by the hard-won labors of the Protestant reformers, without exception, believed and taught that papal Rome fulfilled exactly every detail foretold concerning this new religious edifice, and was therefore this apostate and antichrist power, which, while purporting to be the only true Church of Christ, was actually fighting against him. When this devastating exposure became revealed from the Scriptures themselves, the first reaction of papal Rome was to try to destroy the Bible. They thus gathered up all the early English Bibles they could lay their hands on and had public burnings of them. One of these ceremonies was conducted by Bishop Tunstall in AD 1530 at Paul's Cross, London, when William Tyndale's English translation of the New Testament was burnt publicly. However, when this endeavor eventually proved fruitless, they began to massacre and to burn at the stake the living witnesses of the truth, two of the most notable of whom were Bishops Ridley and Latimer, who were burnt alive at Oxford in 1555 A.D. during the Catholic Mary's reign. This little booklet we'll continue with tomorrow is going to open many, many eyes as to how we have been deceived by the Roman Catholic Church to the degree that we would repudiate Protestantism and the original belief of the Protestant reformers and then go back to the whore of Rome. It's a dastardly deception, and we'll talk about it more tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, C-R-O-S-S, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.